All right, so I was asked to come to this conference to explain evolution, which means I should explain the opposition to it, which is that some people don't like cold, hard, inconvenient reality. Throughout the entire history of agriculture and livestock keeping, people have been unwittingly employing evolution without realizing it, whether it's just picking the right seeds to produce the best crop you've ever seen, or to breeding dogs, horses, cattle, and fowl to whatever traits you want to perpetuate and improve. Artificial selection is an evolutionary mechanism, albeit one that produces traits that are beneficial to the breeder, whereas natural selection produces traits that are beneficial to the organism itself. But it's not all about benefit or detriment, nor even selection. It's about variety, biodiversity. Every individual baby whatever is a little bit different than every other sibling in their clutch or litter or what have you. And some of these subtle differences may be inherited by their offspring and may eventually spread even to the next group generations later via population mechanics, wherein these and other subtle cumulative differences may trend. Thus, any given population can be distinguished into two or more subsets. This pretty much works for anything. You get a large category of anybody, and you're going to see at least two subdivisions thereof. And then that pattern repeats, such that generations later, those two may become 4, and then 8, and 16, and so on, with each daughter set becoming increasingly distinct from their ancestors or cousins, excepting, of course, for the ones that go extinct. When a new form arises, there is no requirement that the old ones die out. Very often, descendants of those earlier forms still exist somewhere, even if they're also becoming more divergent over time, because there's no requirement that everything always improve or become more complex. They usually don't. Increasing complexity and developing advanced capabilities do occur, albeit relatively rarely. That is evolution, descent with inherent modification, a matter of incremental, superficial changes being slowly compiled atop successive tiers of fundamental similarities, which are how clades are identified. To put it another way, it is the method by which, for example, cats branched into so many different breeds within several distinct species in a half a dozen genera within only 3 major divisions: felids, panthers, and Machaerodontidae, the saber-tooth or scimitar cats. Evolution is a continuous process, ongoing, never-ending, with a few parent groups diversifying into an increasing number of descendant groups. That's what biodiversity means. And it seems that no one who criticizes evolution understands that. Whenever you hear somebody bitching about evolution, ask them what evolution is. You will find out they don't know, nor do they want to. I can tell you what evolution is and what it is not. Evolution is not the origin of life. We can talk about that too, if you want. We know quite a lot about that now, but it is way more complicated than you're probably prepared for. If you can't understand evolution, which is relatively simple, then there's no way you would be able to understand abiogenesis, the series of collective chemical processes in incremental development of life. Evolution is not and never was one thing giving birth to or turning into another fundamentally different thing, like creationists like to pretend. That is a straw man distortion that actually violates 2 of the natural laws of evolution: monophyly, that you can't outgrow of your ancestry, and the law of biodiversity, that every new taxa that ever evolved was just a modified version of whatever its ancestors were and still belongs to every ancestral clade that they did. Every time there's a new species of fruit fly or finch, they say, well, it's still a fly, or it's still... Of course it is! That's the law of nature that applies here. Creationist apologists are afraid of forbidden knowledge that will dispel their favorite fantasy, so they feel compelled to post misrepresented misinformation to mislead and deceive those who might understand and thus accept demonstrable reality, because they're desperate to preserve belief in a fable that we already knew centuries ago cannot really be true. Even the evangelical Christian geneticist Francis Collins admits that Adam and Eve do not fit the evidence and cannot be the ancestors of humanity because, he says, it is genetically impossible for two people to be the progenitors of so much diversity, genetic diversity, that we have in the human genome right now. And long before Christianity, even before the Hebrew Bible, Greek philosophers like Anaximander saw an apparent connection between seemingly unrelated animals. Amphibians like salamanders begin their lives looking like fish. But then they mature, they move on to land, they lose their gills, and now they look like lizards. And lizards typically have 4 legs, each with 5 toes and a long tail. And the tail might change shape, or 1 or 2 of the toes might be lost or specialized in some descendant groups, but otherwise it seemed to Anaximander that these animals must be related, though he couldn't figure out how. He already knew that new breeds of dogs or fowls could be derived through selective breeding, but that was the only mechanism yet known in his time. The idea of autonomous natural processes working without the guidance of an intelligent designer has always offended those who prefer to believe in a magical creation, where a deity, which is basically a man made out of magic, effectively says abracadabra and literally speaks everything out of nothing. And some forms of theism assume that nothing can ever happen unless some God wants it to, and it can only happen if that God wills it to. But the popularity of this particular idea, that varieties may be produced by interbreeding, may have inspired the authors of the 16th chapter of the Bhagavad Gita to include the Hindu god Lord Krishna as the first creationist to complain about the godless process of evolution, when he said this: "The persons of the demonic nature say, the entire cosmic manifestation is unreal, without a creator, without a supreme controller, without cause, originating from natural cohabitation due only to lust, nothing more than this." Lord Krishna's gripe was exactly the same as what modern creationists still say today. A couple centuries after Anaximander, Aristotle arranged his apparent connection between life forms into a ladder of life, Scala Naturae, which was later rebranded as the evolutionary ladder. But as evolution is not about continuous improvement, but simply diversification, the ladder doesn't really adequately illustrate. The better analogy is that of a repeatedly branching tree. If you went back in time, anywhere from a few centuries to a couple thousand years ago, you'd have a hard time being a vegetarian because you wouldn't recognize many of the groceries available at that time. Back then, corn didn't exist. Corn was, back then, a wild grass, literally grass. You've seen grass that looks like corn? That's where corn came from. And likewise, wild cabbage wasn't really cabbage yet, but more of a weed. People selectively bred that one plant to enhance certain aspects of it. You could derive actual cabbage from that, or you could cultivate Brussels sprouts, kohlrabi, kale, broccoli, or cauliflower, very different foods, all from that one sparse-looking weed. That's how one original form can lead to many diverse descendants. Centuries of selection gradually produced produce to be proud of. Carrots were originally unrecognizable roots without their current flavor or color. And what would eventually become apples, pears, and peaches were then just a few tart and tiny berries, barely bigger than the seeds inside them. Bananas, too, were originally four-sided and full of large, noxious seeds surrounded by tissue that was so tough that it had to be boiled before you can eat it. We know that because some of these earlier forms still exist. And a painting from the 1600s depicts an earlier form of watermelon that is not tasty, it looks nearly inedible. At that time, there wasn't a wide choice of cattle breeds either. They had the original aurochs, which is the wild bull on which all Western beef and dairy cattle are derived, but which went extinct when the last one died in 1627, just 35 years before the death of the last dodo. And what is a dodo? It turns out that dodos were originally pigeons. They got blown to a remote island that had plenty of food and no natural predators. No reason to leave, no reason to go anywhere, no reason to fly anymore. Until people came along and brought dangerous invasive species with them. An interesting thing that happens with evolution on islands is that rats and lizards and pigeons and other typically small animals will grow much larger than they normally would have, while pythons and elephants and other normally large animals will be a dwarf, even humans will be a dwarf form of their relatives on the mainland. And that's why dodos became the largest pigeons and the only flightless ones, such that they don't even look like pigeons anymore. And that again is evolution. And creationism cannot account for or even pretend to explain this or anything else in nature. At about the time that dodos were being wiped out by sailors, Danish naturalist Nicholas Stine made some important discoveries about fossils. Random people have found small fossil shells and disarticulated bone fragments, here or there since forever, but they had no way to know what they were or what they meant. And back then they thought that fossils grew out of the ground naturally, that these were just natural formations that just happened to look like, parts of animals. But there was one guy in the 1600s who had special training in both geology and biology at the same time, and he saw in fossils a connection between them. He noticed that sharks' teeth matched what were then called tongue stones. And he realized that these were not rocks that just coincidentally look like shark's teeth. These were at one point actually shark's teeth, but that they had become lithified, that they had become stone after being buried for such a very long time. So, of course, the frequently found seashells, now lithified, obviously were not always stone. They were once living clams and such. And then there were ammonites, which are fossils of a prehistoric form of mollusk. But many people have seen the fossils for these, but no one has ever seen one alive. Certain types of these and a number of other fossils occur at only one geologic level or strata, and below that to a certain point, but not above. And we know that range of strata now as the Mesozoic era. Above that, there are no more ammonites. Beneath that, there are trilobites, which do not occur in the Mesozoic era. The more Stine studied fossils, the more he realized that each type comes from a particular level or strata. So he began to identify the geologic column as a rock record of the history of life on Earth. It was then a mystery how some forms of life ended at one point in time to replace by new forms. And this was compounded in 1735 when a Swedish botanist took it upon himself to classify all forms of plants. And then he discovered something that drew him to also classify all forms of mammals as well. And Carolus Linnaeus was a creationist who understood how it was possible to breed new varieties of dogs and cats and cattle and fowl, but all of those, he thought, were just variations within a species. However, his system of classification showed a very different pattern, not the created kinds that one expected. Instead, it showed what looks like a family tree. One parent category, which he called a kingdom, with a few daughter sets that he called phyla. Each phyla has at least two more daughter sets called class. Each class has at least two orders. Every order has at least two families. Every family has at least two genera, and every genus has at least two species. Though it is possible to have, and usually do, have more daughter sets at every level. That implies a familial descent, one which he could not explain without understanding how new species could come about, which they apparently occasionally did, not during creation week, not all at once, like the Bible says, but numerous times throughout Earth's history. Taxonomy also revealed some uncomfortable associations. Linnaeus classified people into four categories, four species: European white people, American red people, Asian yellow people, and African black people. It was a common belief at that time, and I've heard racists say this even during my lifetime, that God created different races separately and put them on different continents with the intention that they remain separate. According to this belief system, Adam and Eve were white. But Linnaeus noticed another problem. He didn't yet know about gorillas. They would be another century before gorillas were known to science, but he knew about chimpanzees and orangutans, which he classified as two other species of humans. And this outraged his contemporaries. So in 1747, Linnaeus wrote a challenge to the scientific community of his day. He said, "I demand of you and of the whole world that you show me a generic character, one that is according to the generally accepted principles of classification by which to distinguish man and ape. I myself, most assuredly, know of none. I wish someone would indicate one to me. But if I had called man an ape or vice versa, I would have fallen under the ban of all ecclesiastics. It may be that as a naturalist, I ought to have done so." The response to that challenge from the scientific community was to create an arbitrarily contrived taxon, Pongo, that was meant to include all the apes, everything in the ape family, except for humans. All of them except for us. Just so that they would have some way, some technicality on which to say that humans are not apes, even though they already knew better. Of course, within the last 30 or 40 years, modern genetics has confirmed that we're not just similar to apes, we are apes, both by definition and derivation, not just physically, morphologically, but genetically too. Thus, taxonomy had to be corrected. Pongo was restructured to be a genus-level category just for the Asian apes, that being orangutans and their close relatives, Gigantopithecus and that sort of thing. And all of the other apes and humans are now properly classified within the family of apes, Hominoidea. Then, back in the 1700s, Scottish geologist James Hutton made a series of observations showing that the terrain that we see all around us, that mountain range is not exactly as God made it, but that everything is in constant movement and transition, albeit very slowly. He explained how deposition and erosion are both going on all the time, but not in balance. It's usually one more than the other, and it might switch the other way for a while. From his studies, we realized that the earth was in fact so old that it exceeds human reckoning. And I've known people who believed that extinction was impossible because God would seek to protect all of his creations. And that's why the Bible says that God took it upon himself to bring forth two of every species to the ark for Noah to save. But of course, that story was written before paleontology revealed that 99% of everything that has ever lived is already extinct now. Thus, if the fable of Noah's Ark is true, and we know and can show for certain that it is not, but that would mean that Mesozoic dinosaurs and pterosaurs, Paleozoic anapsids and therapsids and Cenozoic mammals, including some egg-laying mammals that you've never heard of, and a whole lot of categories of other animals all went extinct simultaneously, instantaneously, as soon as they stepped off that floating boat, or box. Technically, it was a box. And by the 1700s, before we knew anything about paleofauna, we already had the dodo and the aurochs to confirm that whole species can indeed go extinct. So now that people knew what fossils were, there was a wave of intrepid scholars looking for them with the knowledge of how to recognize them and identify them, how to extract them from the rock. And every significant find would then get shipped off to the museum or university to be carefully analyzed and cataloged. And over the course of a century, in the 1700s, they found a lot of interesting things that lived long ago, but that are definitely long gone now. One of the first major fossil finds was initially mistaken for both a whale and a crocodile. But it was probably more interesting than that was that it was found 90 feet deep in a Dutch quarry. Tropical sea serpents do not live in the North Sea. Maybe surprised to hear that. And nothing could bury an animal like that deep all at once. Hutton had already shown us how it took a really long time to build up that much deposition to bury it that deep. And Europe obviously had a very different climate before this giant tropical lizard died. Napoleon seized that fossil and brought it to one of his experts, Georges Cuvier, the father of paleontology. It was originally labeled as the Maastricht crocodile. But after Cuvier got a hold of it and he carefully examined it, he realized this is a lizard. Now, this was before the discovery of dinosaurs, but this was not a dinosaur. This was an actual lizard. But the interesting thing was that it was a lizard the size of a whale. And not only was it as big as a whale, but this was a lizard that was a whale in the sense that it was fully marine. Its hands or limbs had been fused into flippers so that it would be just as crippled on the shore as a whale would be. Cuvier also realized that whaling had been a busy industry for many centuries by that point, and that whalers knew every species of whale. He knew that lizards, being air-breathing animals, would have to stay most of their time near the surface, just like whales do. But nobody had ever seen something like this anywhere, ever. And these would have been man-eaters. They're obviously carnivorous. These would have made the news if there was still any of them out there somewhere. And likewise, Cuvier knew of other fossils that were like elephants and rhinos and things of that sort, but they were very different than the modern forms. So in 1796, Cuvier made an announcement regarding mammoths and mastodons. He said, "What has become of these two enormous animals, of which one no longer finds any living traces, and so many others which the remains are found everywhere on earth, and perhaps none still exist? The fossil rhinoceros of Siberia are very different from all known rhinoceros. It is the same with the alleged fossil bears of Ansbach, the fossil crocodile of Maastricht, the species of deer from the same locality, the 12-foot-long animal with no incisor teeth and with clawed digits, of which the skeleton has just been discovered in Paraguay. None of them have any human analog. Living analog. Why? Lastly, does one find no petrified human bone? All of these facts, consistent among themselves and not opposed by any report, seem to me to prove the existence of a previous world to ours, destroyed by some kind of catastrophe. That discovery shook the scientific world. And then in 1822, the first dinosaur fossils were discovered. And then immediately, more dinosaurs and pterosaurs and ichthyosaurs and plesiosaurs and many other things as career paleontologists emerged and diverged to all the wilderness areas wherever fossils might be preserved to be discovered. And soon it was revealed that there wasn't just one previous prehistoric world, but a succession of them in distinct eras, each divided into three or more periods, and eventually finer subdivisions were determined. And whether we look at the fossil record or whether we look at taxonomy, and especially when we look at both, we see a familial descent of some kind. Again, everyone knew how to breed new varieties within a single interbreeding species, microevolution. But no one had any explanation for how to derive new species that could no longer interbreed with their ancestral or sister groups, macroevolution. Then in 1859, Charles Darwin came along and explained the origin of species by means of natural selection. His book proposed two mechanisms. There are more that we know of now, but then he proposed two that use gradual processes occurring at the population level that could account for all of this. And again, we have one original population becoming distinguished into two daughter groups. And let's say, for example, that they're geographically separated by a seaway or a desert or a mountain range or what have you. Just even if only for a few hundred years. Then if you find a lone wanderer in the no man's land between these two groups, you might be able to tell just by looking at it which group it came from. Because each group develops its own unique particularities or peculiarities that are not shared with the other group anymore because there's no genetic intermixing. And likewise, of course, the other group will continue to become more different on their own as they build up their own peculiarities on their own. If enough time passes with these groups in isolation, then enough differences will arise that if they were to interbreed, they would only be able to produce infertile hybrids. But if they get to the point where they can't produce anything at all, and by the way, if they can produce infertile hybrids, then that would be something we would expect of two species in the same genus. But if they can't produce anything living at all, then these are definitely different species and maybe in a different genus or even family. Natural selection typically works on subtle differences between related organisms. It's like an algorithm that works that for animals with thicker fur would, of course, do better in colder climates, and variations in beaks, shapes, or strengths or thicknesses will help finches specialize in different types of food. And they can either compete against other things using the same food source, or they can take advantage of other food sources where there is no competition. And all of this happens over generations of variations being tested against a dynamic environment. And virtually any apparent design in any organism can be explained by this mechanism. And nowadays we know of at least 4 different types of speciation. And the evolution of new species has been directly observed and documented dozens of times, both in the lab and in naturally controlled conditions in the field. And genomic comparisons confirm how they are related. In Darwin's day, there were not many transitional species yet known. He predicted there should be several found in the fossil record, but he also wrote how we would never likely find all of them, and he gave the reasons why. But he made specific predictions about 2 of them, 2 particular intermediates that he expected we would find. First, his associates had noticed how similar dinosaurs were to birds, especially in their legs and feet. And Darwin himself noticed how theropods, which only have 3 fingers, theropod dinosaurs have 3 fingers, he noticed that birds' wings look like theropod fingers, but fused together. So he said that if evolution is true, and only if evolution is true, then we should find a more primitive type of bird that has reptilian features and specifically would have unfused wing fingers. His prediction came true within just 2 years of his publication. And it's not in his book, it was in private correspondence where he made this, but it was 1861 in a German quarry where they finally found Archaeopteryx, and they have since found dozens of similar species that all meet the description that he gave, that have reptilian fingers, that have reptilian features and unfused fingers and all of that. And then in his most important book, he made another prediction. He noted that humans have more in common with the African apes, gorillas and orangutans, gorillas and chimpanzees, rather than orangutans in Asia. So he predicted that the common ancestor of all humanity and apes would be found in Africa, logically. He then went on to describe how the characteristics of the face, skull, teeth, hands, feet, and pelvis of that hypothetical missing link should all be exactly halfway between that of the modern apes that were known at that time and the most primitive humans that were known at that time, that being Neanderthals. That predicted link would remain missing for over a century. So Darwin sadly did not experience the satisfaction. With Archaeopteryx discovery, he knew that his theory was vindicated while he was still alive. Good. But he didn't get to know about this one. Creationists are still crowing that the missing link is still missing. But no, the first one meeting Darwin's predicted description was discovered in 1974, over 50 years ago, and hundreds more individuals from that species and from several similar species, all matching Darwin's description, have discovered since then. And so believers changed their story to say that the hundreds of Australopith fossils are all fake news. Let's just ignore them and dismiss them. I find it truly pathetic that defenders of the faith have to knowingly lie to make believe as they do. So Darwin solved Linnaeus's dilemma, what Linnaeus couldn't figure out. He explained the origin of species, macroevolution. But there were things that Darwin didn't understand, couldn't figure out himself. He knew that there had to be what he called heritable units of information being passed down from both the mother and the father. But he was wrong about what those units of information were or how they worked. Gregor Mendel, an Augustinian monk and hobby farmer who was alive at the time that Darwin was, solved Darwin's dilemma with his discovery of genes in pea plants. And then later, Dutch geneticist Hugo de Vries expanded on Mendel's discovery by proposing mutation theory, which we now know is the ultimate source of new information in the genome. And creationists lie about that too. They say that, what do geneticists know about genetics? Surely not as much as primitive shepherds who believed that if goats mate while looking at striped sticks, they'll bear striped calves. And not everybody accepted or liked the theory of evolution, obviously. And for example, one of Darwin's contemporaries, Lord Kelvin, described himself as a proponent of intelligent design. Creationists today often argue that evolution somehow violates the first and second laws of thermodynamics. But Kelvin was the one who devised those laws, and he disagreed. He said, "The hypothesis that life originated on this earth through moss-grown fragments in the ruins of another world may seem wild and visionary. All I maintain it is not unscientific." Kelvin also used his laws of thermodynamics to conclude that the earth had to be on the order of at least 20 million years old, even if the bowels of the earth did not continually reheat themselves radioactively, which of course they do. And once he realized that, of course, it pushed the age of the earth back much further. And this gets us to the use of radiometric dating, which first began in 1907. And nowadays, we can look up maps of the Geological Survey for anywhere in the world, and we'll see that they were derived by thousands of separate readings all over the world using a dozen or so different isotopes, and all of them confirm the same image, the same ages for all of the exposed strata being tested. Yet, creationists still pretend as if all of that is fake. Every one of thousands of readings all over the world. So we've come from the 6th century BC, before calendar, through the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, and now we've come to the early 20th century, to 1925 specifically, when all our knowledge, all the knowledge that we have gained, is now being systematically undermined by defenders of the faith, whom Nietzsche described as not wanting to know what is true, because they want to make believe something else instead. Next month, July of 2025, is the 100th anniversary of the Scopes monkey trial, hailed as the most famous court case of that time. And if you're too young to remember what happened 100 years ago, that's when, as the court transcript explains, on May 25th, 1925, John T. Scopes was indicted in this county for violating what is generally known as the anti-evolution statute, which makes it unlawful to teach in the universities, normals, and other public schools, which are supported in whole or in part by the public school funds of any state, any theory that denies the story of divine creation of man as taught in the Bible, and to teach instead thereof that man descended from a lower form of animals. These people made a law that you cannot teach what is evidently true, what was already accepted by consensus of mainstream science for decades prior to that, and that instead, that you can only teach what we know is not true, nor even possible. That law became a law just a couple months before they arrested this high school science teacher, and that ridiculous law remained on the books for another 42 years until 1967. In the marketplace of ideas, and especially in any avenue of science, it should be that we weigh multiple hypotheses at once, whenever possible, and determine which ones are best supported by the most reliable evidence. Evolution is one of the best supported theories in all of science, right up there with atomic theory. And if you're worried about nuclear war, don't worry, atoms are just a theory. Meanwhile, intelligent design creationism meets exactly none of the criteria required of a scientific theory. There is no mechanism, no observation, no facts and evidence, and importantly, no ability to explain or predict any data. Lord Kelvin said correctly that science is bound by the everlasting law of honor to face fearlessly every problem which can be fairly presented to it, If a probable solution consistent with the ordinary course of nature can be found, we must not invoke an abnormal act of creative power. Creationists refuse to accept or admit that because they are not bound by honor. They make believe in lies. That's the most polite way I can put that. Evolution is and has been directly observed and documented numerous times in different ways with no aspect of anything supernatural has ever been confirmed to exist at all. And creationism is only attested in a single compilation of fantasy folklore. Evolution is not just observable, but also testable, demonstrable, in many ways verifiable, and sometimes even repeatable. While creationists can't demonstrate, verify anything, and can only repeat lies and nonsense. Seriously, challenge a creationist to name one actual fact in evidence for creationism. Anything that is both verifiably true and supportive of their position. It's never both. It's usually neither, and that's why I say there's absolutely no truth to it. Importantly, science has to be not just testable, but potentially falsifiable. There has to be a way to show that it's wrong if it is. Creationists will not accept that their fables are disproved and are dishonest enough that they keep promoting the same fables even after they have been disproved. Darwin himself said, "If it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not possibly have been formed by numerous successive slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down." Intelligent design creationists made that their goal. However, every one of their claims about irreducible complexity had already been refuted in science, even by Christian biologists, before it was also exposed as fraudulent in a court of law. The case of Kitzmiller versus Dover showed that intelligent design was really a criminal conspiracy to get around the laws against teaching religion in public schools. And you may have heard today's creationists say that we should teach both sides, as if we should teach both the fact and the fiction. That'd be fine if there were two sides to teach. But evolution is the only explanation of biodiversity there ever was. And it is a verifiable fact of population genetics, fossils, and phylogeny, while creationism is just empty assertions of impossible absurdity, dishonestly asserted as if it was a matter of fact, and supported entirely by frauds, falsehoods, and fallacies with no word of truth to it whatsoever. When creationists say that we should teach both sides, what they mean is that they want to teach anti-science propaganda instead of evolution, and then teach the Bible as if it was history. But in the Scopes monkey trial, we saw that creationists don't really want to teach evolution at all, not even a perverted version of it. They want it illegal to even discuss it. Creationists know that they can't use science because science only always ever contradicts them. And they refuse to acknowledge what that means, so they use the courts instead. And they usually fail there too. But in this one case, they won, but only because the court was so incredibly biased. There are many examples of this, but let's start with how they begin the case by saying a prayer. Think about how appropriate that is. "O God, our divine Father, we recognize Thee as the supreme ruler of the universe, in whose hands the lives and destinies of all men and of all the world. We approach unto Thy province this morning, we trust, with that degree of reverence that is due unto Thy supreme majesty, and with the consciousness of the fact that every good and perfect gift comes down from Thee, Father of lights. We praise Thy holy and blessed name, that Thou hast made it possible for us to approach Thee at all times and all places at the throne of Thy divine grace, with the assurance that we will find grace and help in our time of need. We are conscious, our Father, that Thou art the source of our wisdom and our power." That's how they opened a court case on evolution. All they did here was chant, "Really? Shut up." All they did here was promote the mantra or chant the mantra of make-believe, claiming a list of alleged facts that are not facts. They're only baseless, unwarranted assumptions, which is what religion is all about, because faith is all about pretending to know things no one even can know. And notice also how this opening prayer poisoned the well against anyone trying to promote science, which is here depicted as being opposed to the alleged Word of God. I'm going to take a drink. I'm drinking dark truth. I've never had this one before, but it somehow seemed appropriate. Okay. Now pay attention to this one run-on sentence, which is the next line out of that opening prayer. We are incapable of thinking pure thoughts or performing righteous deeds unaided by thee and by thy divine Spirit, with the consciousness of our weaknesses and our frailty and our ignorance. We come to thee this morning of our divine Father, that we may seek from thee that wisdom so transact business of the court in such a way and manner that thy name be honored and glorified among all men. And we therefore beseech thee, our Father, that thou will give to the court this morning a sufficient share of the divine Spirit that will enable the court to so administer its affairs that justice may come to all, and that God's standard of purity and holiness may be upheld. That sentence of that prayer was 122 words, and it didn't stop there. It went on and on, covering the whole first page of the transcript, 8 paragraphs in 2 columns. That prayer went on for so long, just like you just heard, that it began to sound like the kind of prayers we hear parodied in a Monty Python skit. And what is important to note is that they pretend as if there is no God, then their brains can't think. But their brains already don't think, or rather, won't think. Then they're pleading with their magic imaginary friend that in a court that is evaluating evolution versus creationism, then their opening prayer demands that the result be that God's name be honored and glorified, meaning that the jury has already been instructed how to rule before any evidence was even presented. And to ensure this, the judge then forbade any of the expert witnesses to present any scientific evidence. There was a movie made about this case called Inherit the Wind, which I very much enjoyed when I first saw it. I remember laughing my ass off as a little kid watching this movie. I guess just shades of who I would become. But I later did not like the movie once I realized how they had changed so many of the facts. I think that history is sacred. You should try to stick to what really happened as closely as possible. And I wish that the script of the film had stayed with the transcript of the court. Then, or therein, the prosecuting attorney, a young earth creationist named William Jennings Bryan, testified as a witness. He's the prosecuting attorney, but he ends up on the witness stand somehow. And he bragged about how unrealistic and how pig-headed he is when he said, if the Bible said that Jonah swallowed the whale, I would believe it. What better example could there be that Friedrich Nietzsche was right about faith not wanting to know what is true? The truth is what the facts are. If you don't care what the facts are, then you don't care what the truth is. And that's intellectually dishonest, but in my personal opinion, that's also stupid. To further convey my point, it's important to remember that religious stupidity is not the only reason to reject evolution. There are other types of stupidity too. So let's remove the intent to preserve a foolish belief and then see how dumb the rejection of this science is. Not every atheist accepts evolution. Not even every atheist scientist accepts evolution. There is at least one godless geneticist who does not. Dr. Perianand Senapathy is a molecular biologist and genome researcher. His book, The Independent Birth of Organisms, actually posits what was the worst description of evolution I've ever heard. A creationist once told me that she thought that evolution was where one group of molecules gathers together to become a man and another group of molecules gathers together to become a fish. However stupid you think that sounds, that is exactly what Dr. Senapathy is proposing in his book, that every species of crab, for example, spawned from their own separate and personally unique abiogenesis event, where a bunch of chemicals just amass and don't create a very primitive form of life. No, they create advanced forms of life. Everything individually, fully formed like this, and seemingly related to everything else as well. And all of this happens without any inherent modification from a common ancestor. Over half the people who reviewed Senapathi's book gave it only 2 stars. A few others with no apparent scientific understanding at all rated it a bit higher, but it still worked out to only 3.4 out of 5 stars. The top review of this book complains about how stupid it is. Senapathi's summary description of his own book says that Darwin's theory is fundamentally incorrect, and that there is no scientific theory which has ever been propounded to explain the origin and diversity of organisms on Earth that does not involve evolution. Independent Birth of Organisms is the first ever written book that proposes a new theory for the origin and diversity of life on Earth without involving evolution in any manner. Not in any manner. Think about what that means. He dismisses natural and sexual selection, even though both of these mechanisms have already been demonstrated and confirmed multiple times before his book was even written. What evolution is, at its most basic, is genetic variation over generations and reproductive populations. That's the definition of evolution. And this, of course, continues until that original parent group can be distinguished into 2 or more daughter sets. And Senapathy says that doesn't happen, even though exactly that has been repeatedly observed and confirmed throughout the entirety of human history, and genetically confirmed as well, not just at the micro level, but with the origin of new species as well. And now remember, this idiot says that without evolution in any manner, that means that the Australian dingo, the African painted dog, the South American bush dog, the Asian raccoon dog, and every species of fox all crawled out of the primordial ooze, fully formed, accidental, just a mix of Kool-Aid and water, whatever it is that produced this, without any acknowledgement, without any acknowledgement of what confirms common ancestry. And let me put that more simply. If this dumbass was right, then Great Danes, Dachshunds, and Dalmatians also crawled out of this primordial ooze, fully formed as Dalmatians and Dachshunds, without any respect for paleontology or genetics or anything, because he said no evolution at any level, in any manner, including the fact that we all bred these animals ourselves using evolutionary principles to do it. And worse, Senapathy is a geneticist with a PhD in molecular biology from an institute of science. He has made notable contributions in his field, and his other work depends on and cites evolutionary phylogeny. All biology has to at some point. So we must assume that he eventually learned the error of his ways. But this book, maybe he was still in middle school when he wrote that. Nope, he already had his PhD a decade before. It was published back in 1994, before they had completed any whole genome, so there was as yet no comparative analyses. But now we have many of them, computerized, coming out all the time. And every one of them, to date, always confirms common ancestry of every sampled organism at multiple levels. And they give molecular clock estimates of divergence times that consistently match the fossil record pretty closely. There have been many beneficial mutations and evolutionary pathways identified genetically too, but Senapathy ignores all of that from his own field, as well as the thousands of transitional species that were found since the Scopes monkey trial, most of which have been found just in the last 50 years. The illustration on the cover of his book shows a crab along with a worm, a turtle, a butterfly, and a frog, all crawling out of a pond of primordial soup from incidental molecular configurations, such that a bunch of molecules gathered together to become a butterfly and another bunch of molecules gathered together to become a crab. No rhyme, no reason, they just did. This means that more than 17,500 species of butterflies are not related to each other, nor to moths. But according to Senapathy, they are all accidentally virtually identical with literally no reason why that is. Genomic evidence, of course, shows that butterflies are all related to each other and to moths and to caddisflies and more distantly to all other insects. And there is genetic evidence now showing that the origin of insects is actually paraphyletically nested within Pancrustacea. So the insects are definitely related to the crab. Of course, there was already a profound amount of evidence to show that the turtle was related to the frog as well, and that all of them are related to the worm. But let's just look at the crab. for a moment. The crab on the cover of his book. The illustration shows a red crab, so we're going to assume that it's the Atlantic deep sea red crab. This species is from the genus Chession. There are more than 40 other crabs in that same genus. 40 other crabs that are almost identical to this one and also similar to the Dungeness crab, except that the Dungeness are in a different genus of a different family. What Cenopathy is suggesting is equivalent to rolling 1,000,000 dice 1,000,000 times, and almost all of them come with the same number, just enough difference to make different species. And there is no accounting for the evidence of evolution. And there's no reason for why they should all be functional, why they should all have organs and all of that. It's almost as if this is that old argument of a tornado in a junkyard that creates a jet plane. This is a geneticist arguing the exact same thing, just as badly. Crabs are animals, what Linnaeus called kingdom Animalia, meaning that they are multicellular eukaryotes with an internal digestive tract. They're in phylum Arthropoda, meaning that they have exoskeletons and a number of other particular traits that no random assemblage of molecules would be able to duplicate. More specifically, they're a subset of Mandibulata, arthropods with mandibles. Even more specifically, they are pancrustacea because they are crustaceans, meaning mandibulates that have a malformation such that their gills are attached to their legs in some instances. The taxonomic class is Melicostracea, crustaceans identified by having specifically segmented head, abdomen, and thorax, with some of these segments being developmentally fused together in a very particular way. Evolutionary inheritance explains all of that. Random dice rolls do not. There are at least 15 subsets of Melicostracea, one of them being Decapoda, meaning 10-legged crabs, lobsters, crayfish, shrimp, and prawns. The dozen or so main subsets of decapods include semi-crabs and almost crabs, just like we'd expect of an evolutionary relationship, along with true crabs. Brachyura. As babies, these have the same kind of tail as lobsters and shrimp and that sort of thing do, but as the crab grows up, then the tail folds in and becomes fused to the underside of the carapace. Okay. Remember, we're not talking about one species here, but 70,000 some odd species so far. They've all have these diagnostic traits just like you would expect of derived synapomorphies. Evolution explains all of these developmental similarities and their hierarchy in the taxonomic tree, as well as their fossil record dating back to the Jurassic period 200 million years ago. But Cenopathy's argument is that an inexplicable association of molecules just randomly fell together, not according to any natural pattern or process, nor by divine design either. And not only did these inexplicably activated molecules spawn every species and subspecies in all the aforementioned groups, but even duplicated their developmental defects. There is no possible explanation there. Only an evolutionary phylogeny could account for any and all of this. Therefore, Cenopathy's PhD degree exists as proof that just because you're really smart doesn't mean that you're not also paradoxically stupid. With or without God, there is no way to explain biodiversity without evolution. Even if God exists, evolution is still at least mostly true, and creationism is still entirely false. Virtually all the pioneers of evolutionary theory were Christian, and some of the modern champions of evolution still are. One of them was Russian Orthodox Christian geneticist Theodosius Dobzhansky, who published a scientific study in 1973 bearing the title that nothing in biology makes sense except in light of evolution. And that's true. Evolution is the one and only explanation of biodiversity, scientific or otherwise. It is the only theory that can account for any of this data, and it covers it all. I don't know why anyone has a problem with this. It's an inescapable fact. We can effectively prove it with an overwhelming preponderance of evidence beyond reasonable doubt. So it doesn't matter if you don't like it or if you want to pretend something else. Evolution is a demonstrable reality. That's the truth, and I wish people would stop lying about it and just fucking deal with it. Yeah.